A widow and her daughter were struggling to keep their little roadside diner alive. But on a freezing night when a group of weary truck drivers knocked on the door asking for warmth and a cup of coffee, she didn't hesitate to let them in, sharing her very last meal. A few days later, convoys of trucks rolled in one after another, engines roaring like thunder. What she witnessed next would forever change the way she understood miracles. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories every day. The snow came down the way it does in the mountains of Colorado, thick and relentless, erasing the world one flake at a time. Inside Carter's kitchen, Sarah Carter stood behind the cash register, her hand smoothing the creases of yet another overdue notice from the bank. The paper felt thin between her fingers, as fragile as everything else in her life lately. "Mama, it's almost 10, Maya said softly from across the diner. Her daughter was 23, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's quiet determination. She'd been wiping down the same table for the past 5 minutes, the kind of busy work you do when there's nothing else left to do. Sarah nodded but didn't move toward the door to flip the sign. "Just a few more minutes," Sarah said, though she knew no one was coming. They hadn't had a customer since noon. And that had been old Joe Miller, who came every Tuesday out of loyalty more than hunger. The highway reroute 3 years ago had been the beginning of the end. What had once been a bustling stop for truckers heading east through the Rockies was now a forgotten building on a forgotten road. The cash register held $27.43. The bills stacked on the counter beside it told a different story. 3 months behind on the mortgage, 2 months on the electric, a furnace that needed replacing before next winter. The bank's final notice gave her 30 days. 30 days to come up with $12,000 or lose everything. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the foreclosure notice. Her eyes drifted to the photograph hanging near the coffee station, the only decoration she'd kept when she'd stripped the walls of everything else to sell. Marcus stood beside his Peterbilt, one hand on the chrome bumper, his smile wide enough to light up the whole frame. That picture was taken 32 years ago, back when he was still driving cross-country routes, back before they'd saved enough to buy this place together. Before Highway 29 became the center of their universe. Before the highway department rerouted the main road 5 miles east and took their dreams with it. Before Marcus collapsed behind that same counter where Sarah now stood, his heart giving out at 58, leaving her with a business she didn't know how to save and a daughter who'd given up her own dreams to help. She thought about Marcus, about the way he used to fill this place with his laughter during the morning rush. He'd known every trucker by name, remembered their favorite meals, asked about their families. He treated this diner like it was a cathedral and every customer like they were kin. "Mama?" Sarah looked up. Maya stood at the window, her dish rag frozen mid-wipe, her voice strange. "Someone's pulling in." The door opened with the jingle of the brass bell, a gust of wind and snow blew in, and with it came a man Sarah had never seen before. He was maybe 50, with tangled hair visible beneath a dark blue trucker's cap. His face was weathered in that particular way that comes from years behind a windshield, watching America scroll by through reinforced glass. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice like gravel rolling down a hill. "Any chance you're still serving? It's turning into a real mess out there." Sarah glanced at the clock above the grill. 9:54. Every instinct told her to say no, to flip that sign and go upstairs to the tiny apartment where the heat worked better than it did down here. To stop pretending that staying open another 6 minutes would make any difference at all. But something in the man's eyes stopped her. They were tired eyes, worried eyes, the eyes of someone who'd been driving too long and still had too far to go. "Kitchen's still hot," she heard herself say. "What can I get you?" The man's shoulders dropped with visible relief. "Coffee, black, and whatever you've got that's warm." He crossed to the counter, his boots tracking snow across floors Sarah had mopped 3 times today out of sheer nervous energy. "Name's Raymond, but everybody calls me Ray." He settled onto a stool, his large frame making the old seat creak. "Appreciate you being open. They've closed the highway about 10 miles back, complete whiteout conditions." Sarah's hand froze halfway to the coffee pot. "Closed it for how long?" "Till morning at least, maybe longer." Ray pulled off his cap, revealing close gray hair. "Way it's coming down, I was lucky to make it this far before they blocked it off." The bell above the door jingled again. 2 more truckers came through the door, shaking snow from their jackets like wet dogs. Then another. Then 3 more, their voices low and relieved as they realized they'd found shelter. By 10:15, Sarah had 12 truckers scattered throughout her diner, their presence filling the space with a sound she hadn't heard in months: the low rumble of conversation, the scrape of chair legs, the clink of coffee cups, the simple noise of human beings being human together. Sarah's mind raced as she moved through the kitchen. She had enough soup for maybe 6 people. The freezer held a few pounds of ground beef, some chicken that needed to be used soon, and not much else. She'd planned to restock on Friday when her small allowance has arrived. The only reliable income she had left since her back injury last year made it hard to stand for long shifts. "Mama," Maya whispered, appearing at her elbow with empty hands and worried eyes. "We don't have enough food for all of them." Sarah looked at her daughter and saw the girl who turned down a full scholarship to Denver State to stay here and help, who'd taken a waitressing job she was overqualified for because her mama needed her, who'd never once complained about the sacrifice, even though Sarah could see the college brochures hidden in her room, even though she heard Maya crying sometimes late at night when she thought no one could hear. "We'll make it work," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady even as her heart hammered. "We don't turn away hungry people. Not in this house." Sarah moved through the kitchen with the kind of efficiency that comes from 30 years of practice. She stretched what little she had, made sandwiches from the last of the bread, heated the soup, and watered it down just enough to make it go further, started another pot of coffee. When it became clear it still wouldn't be enough, she sent Maya upstairs to raid their personal supplies. The pasta they'd been planning to eat this week, the canned vegetables from the pantry, the frozen casserole meant for their own dinners. "You folks planning to head out once you've eaten?" Sarah asked Ray, who seemed to have become the unofficial spokesman for the group. Ray shook his head slowly. "Highway Patrol says nothing's moving till morning at the earliest, maybe longer if this keeps up." He gestured toward the window where his rig sat barely visible through the curtain of falling snow. "Motels in town are already full, called ahead. Looks like we'll be sleeping in our trucks tonight." Sarah followed his gaze. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees according to the thermometer outside. The wind was picking up, rattling the old windows, howling around the corners of the building like something alive and angry. She knew what it meant to sleep in a truck during weather like this. Marcus had done it more times than she could count before they'd saved enough to buy this place. He told her about waking up with ice on the inside of the windows, about running the engine all night and praying you didn't run out of fuel, about the bone-deep cold that no amount of blankets could touch. "You can't sleep in your trucks in this," she said, the words coming out before her practical side could stop them. "You'll freeze." "Wouldn't be the first time, ma'am," another trucker called out, a younger man with kind eyes and laugh lines. But Sarah could see the concern on their faces, could see them doing the math. How long their fuel would last, whether their rigs could handle idling all night in sub-zero temperatures, what would happen if something went wrong. She thought of the empty diner, of the bills she couldn't pay, of the foreclosure notice that gave her 30 days to come up with money she didn't have. She thought of Marcus, of his big heart that had gotten them into financial trouble more than once because he could never turn away someone in need. She thought of what he would do. "The diner stays open all night," Sarah heard herself say, "and I've got a small apartment upstairs with some spare blankets and pillows. It's not much, but it's warm and it's dry. You're welcome to stay." The diner went quiet. 12 faces turned to look at her, and Sarah saw the surprise in every one of them. "Ma'am," Ray said carefully, "that's real generous, but we couldn't impose like that. You don't even know us." "I know you're people who are stuck in a storm," Sarah replied, "and I know this building has heat and space. That's enough." Ray studied her face for a long moment. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," she said. And somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where grief and hope tangled together like old rope, she felt something shift. Something that had been frozen for 5 years starting, ever so slightly, to thaw. Around 10 o'clock that night, the furnace made a sound that Sarah had been dreading for the past 2 winters, a deep mechanical groan, a rattling wheeze and then nothing. The temperature in the diner immediately began its slow, inexorable drop. Sarah stood in the cramped utility room, staring at the ancient heating system with a despair so heavy it felt like hands around her throat. She didn't have money to fix it. She didn't even have money to call a repairman to tell her what was wrong. The truckers upstairs and throughout the diner were depending on her for warmth, for safety, for shelter from a storm that showed no signs of stopping, and she couldn't even provide that. "Mind if I take a look?" Sarah turned to find Ray standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on a paper napkin. His face was kind, patient, free of judgment. "I don't have money to pay you," Sarah said, and hated herself for having to say it. Hated the way poverty stripped away your dignity one honest admission at a time. Ray waved that away like it was smoke. Didn't ask for money, ma'am. Asked if I could look. He moved past her into the tiny room, crouching down beside the furnace with a series of small grunts that spoke of a back that knew hard work. Sarah watched as his large calloused hands moved over the machinery with surprising gentleness, touching, testing, listening. By the time Ray finished tightening the last bolt, their breath hung in the air like ghosts. Then with a low rumble, the furnace came back to life, and Sarah nearly cried from the sound of it. Should hold through the night, Ray said, standing and stretching his back with a wince. But you're gonna want to get someone to look at it proper when this weather clears. The pilot light assembly's about shot, and the heat exchangers got some cracks. It's running, but it won't run forever. Add it to the list, Sarah murmured, then immediately wished she could take the words back. Ray studied her face, his expression thoughtful. Tough times. Sarah usually kept her troubles to herself. Had learned even younger, being one of the few families of color in her small town, that you had to be twice as strong and half as needy just to be treated the same. She'd carried that lesson into adulthood, into business ownership, into widowhood. But something about Ray's genuine concern, about the way he'd fixed her furnace without asking for anything in return, without making her feel small or helpless, something about that broke through the careful walls she'd built. Highway reroute took most of my business 3 years ago, she said quietly. We went from 50-60 customers a day to maybe 5 or 6, been barely hanging on since. She nodded toward the window where if you looked hard enough through the falling snow, you could just make out the edge of the for sale sign that had been planted in the frozen ground for 6 months without generating a single inquiry. Banks foreclosing at the end of the month. This month's probably my last. Ray was quiet for a moment, his face unreadable, then he nodded, just once, slow and deliberate. He didn't offer empty platitudes about how it would all work out, didn't tell her to pray harder, or try smarter, or any of the other useless advice people gave when they didn't know what else to say, just acknowledged her truth with a simple nod, and somehow that respect meant more than any words could have. Your husband, the one in the picture? Ray asked. By the coffee station. Was, Sarah said. Heart attack 5 years ago. He a trucker, 15 years before we bought this place. Loved it and hated it in equal measure. Sarah felt a smile tug at her lips despite everything. Said the road was freedom and prison all rolled into one, but he never forgot what it meant to be out there. That's why he wanted this place to be different. Wanted it to feel like home. Ray nodded again, still looking at her with those steady weathered eyes. Well, he said finally, I reckon he'd be proud of what you did tonight. Opening your doors to strangers when you've got nothing left to give. That takes a particular kind of strength. After he left to rejoin the others, Sarah stood alone in the utility room, listening to the furnace rumble and feeling something dangerous blooming in her chest. Hope. By midnight, Sarah had used nearly every scrap of food in the diner and her apartment. She'd made sandwiches from the last of her bread, heated 3 different soups stretched thin with water and canned vegetables, brewed countless pots of coffee. Maya had volunteered her own groceries, the ramen and canned soup she kept in her room. When the truckers tried to pay, Sarah waved them off. Your company is payment enough, she told them. Been too quiet around here since the highway changed. It was true. The diner had been so silent for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be full of life, full of voices and laughter and the clatter of dishes, almost forgotten what Marcus had loved about this place, not the money, but the people, the connections, the stories. The truckers shared tales of the road, close calls in bad weather, strange cargo they'd hauled, characters they'd met at truck stops across America. Sarah found herself laughing for the first time in months, really laughing, the sound coming from somewhere deep in her chest that had been locked tight with grief and worry. This place reminds me of a diner up in Nebraska, one of the older truckers said, a white man with kind eyes and sun-weathered skin, run by an ex-trucker who made the best peach cobbler you ever tasted. What was the name of it? Another asked. Don't recall exactly. Something like Mike's or Marcus's place. Ray, who had been examining the photographs on the wall, suddenly turned. His voice was careful, almost hesitant. Was the owner's name Marcus Carter by any chance? Sarah's head snapped up, her heart suddenly pounding. You knew Marcus? Ray was staring at a particular photograph now. Marcus with a group of fellow truckers at a rest stop somewhere in Wyoming, circa 1998, his arm around Ray's shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. Is this him? Ray asked, his finger hovering near the glass. Marcus Carter, that's my daddy, Maya said softly, moving to stand beside Sarah. Well, I'll be damned, Ray said, his voice rough with emotion. He helped me once years back. My rig broke down in the middle of nowhere, middle of winter. No cell service back then. He paused, his jaw working. Marcus stopped, spent 3 hours in the freezing cold helping me fix it enough to limp to the next town. Wouldn't take a dime for his trouble. Sarah's vision blurred. That sounds like Marcus. You're Marcus Carter's wife. Another trucker joined them, a black woman with silver streaks in her braids. The Marcus Carter, who used to run CB Channel 19 during big storms, guiding folks through the mountain passes. He loved that old CB, Sarah whispered, pointing to the base unit still sitting on a shelf behind the counter. Silent for 5 years now. Said it was a trucker's lifeline. One by one, the truckers began to share stories. Marcus had helped one deliver emergency supplies after a tornado, driving through debris-strewn roads when everyone else turned back. He talked another through a panic attack on an icy bridge, his calm voice on the CB keeping them focused until they reached safety. He'd lent money to a young trucker whose rig was impounded, never asking for it back. He'd organized a convoy to help a driver being harassed by local police, standing up when no one else would. Sarah listened, tears streaming down her face, as these strangers painted a picture of the man she'd loved, not just as she had known him, as husband and father and partner, but as a legend of the open road, a man whose kindness had rippled outward for decades, touching lives in ways she'd never known. He never told me most of these stories, she admitted, her voice breaking. That was Marcus, Ray said gently. Never one to brag, never needed the recognition, just did what was right. Maya wrapped her arm around Sarah's waist, her own face wet with tears. They stood together, mother and daughter, learning about the full measure of the man they'd lost, understanding, finally, why his death had left such a vast emptiness. It wasn't just their loss, it was the loss of everyone who had ever been helped by Marcus Carter's unending generosity. By dawn, the snow had stopped, though drifts piled 6 feet high in some places. The highway remained closed while plows worked to clear the roads. Sarah, who had caught only fragments of sleep between keeping the coffee flowing and making sure everyone was comfortable, felt exhausted down to her bones. But there was something else too, something she hadn't felt in 5 long years, a sense of connection, of belonging, of not being quite so alone. When Highway Patrol finally announced the roads would reopen by noon, there was an almost reluctant atmosphere among the truckers as they prepared to leave. They'd formed something here in this storm-bound night, something fragile and unexpected. What do we owe you? Ray asked, reaching for his wallet. Sarah shook her head firmly. Not a thing. It was my pleasure. You can't mean that. We cleaned you out of nearly every scrap of food, and gave me the best night I've had in 5 years. Sarah countered. Her voice was soft but certain. Consider it payback for all the times Marcus helped one of you out there on the road. The truckers insisted on at least leaving generous tips for Maya, who had stayed all night despite Sarah's protests. They pressed bills into her hands, telling her to use it for college, to follow her dreams, to make her father proud. Ray was the last to leave, lingering by the counter while the others warmed up their rigs outside. That for sale sign, he said finally. Is it just the diner or the whole property? Both, Sarah replied, forcing her voice to stay steady. The apartment upstairs goes with it. Bank's foreclosing end of the month if I can't catch up on the mortgage. Ray nodded, his expression unreadable. Shame to see a place with this much history disappear. Life moves on, Sarah said, trying to sound matter-of-fact rather than heartbroken. The highway moved, so I guess I will too. Ray looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he just nodded, put his cap back on, and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back at her one more time. Thank you, Mrs. Carter, for everything. Then he was gone, and the diner fell silent once more. Not empty exactly, but full of something Sarah couldn't quite name. Like the air after a storm passes, clean and new and full of possibility, even if you couldn't see yet what that possibility might be. The next few days passed quietly. The storm was over, the highway reopened, and life in Holbrook slipped back to its usual rhythm. Only the diner seemed to stand still. Sarah and Maya spent their time cleaning up and trying not to think about what came next. They worked in practiced silence, the kind of quiet that comes from knowing someone so well that words become optional. The diner had never been used so thoroughly, Every table marked with coffee rings, every booth bearing the imprint of bodies, every surface somehow warmer than it had been before the storm. "What are we going to do, Mama?" Maya finally asked as they wiped down the last table. Sarah looked at her daughter, this brave, selfless girl who'd put her own life on hold to help a mother who couldn't even pay her a decent wage. "I don't know, baby. I honestly don't know. We could try to borrow more money, or maybe sell some of the equipment. There's nothing left to borrow against," Sarah said gently. "And the equipment's all mortgaged already. The bank owns everything except our clothes and the photographs on the walls." Maya's face crumpled. "So that's it, we just give up." "I don't know if it's giving up or if it's just accepting reality," Sarah said. "Maybe some things aren't meant to last forever. Maybe we gave it our best shot, and that's enough." But as she said it, the words hung heavy in the air, too final, too empty. Marcus wouldn't have said them. Marcus never stopped fighting, and neither she realized, could she? But even as she said the words, they tasted wrong in her mouth. Marcus had never been one for giving up, and neither she realized, was she? Day later, Sarah began the grim task of packing up Marcus's things. The for sale sign hadn't generated any interest in 6 months, but the bank would be coming at the end of the month regardless. She needed to be ready. She started with the photographs on the walls, taking them down one by one and wrapping them in newspaper. Each one was a memory. Marcus at the grand opening, Marcus with satisfied customers, Marcus behind the grill with his sleeves rolled up and flour on his forearms. She traced the outline of his face in one photo, remembering the exact moment it was taken. Their 10th anniversary. He'd been so happy that day. Last she took down the CB radio base unit that had sat on its shelf behind the counter for 5 years, silent and gathering dust. Sarah held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, running her fingers over the volume knob that Marcus had turned thousands of times. The radio had been his favorite thing in the whole place, more precious to him than any profit margin or positive review. It had connected him to a community that stretched across state lines and time zones, a community of people who'd known him only by his voice, but had loved him for it. "Miss you, old man," Sarah whispered into the empty diner. "I tried. I really tried to keep your dream alive. I'm sorry I couldn't do it." She was wrapping the radio in bubble wrap, tears blurring her vision when she heard it, the distinctive sound of air brakes outside. The rumble of a diesel engine cutting off, then another, then another. Sarah moved to the window, her heart doing something strange and fluttery in her chest. Ray's truck was pulling into the parking lot, and behind it came another semi, and another, and another. They kept coming, filling every parking space, then lining up along the roadside in both directions. Some of the drivers honked their horns in greeting, not the aggressive city honks, but the friendly, rhythmic honks of people saying hello. All of them had their running lights on despite the early evening sun still providing plenty of visibility. Sarah stepped outside, her coat forgotten, her breath coming in short gasps as truck after truck continued to arrive. The cold bit through her thin sweater, but she barely felt it. Ray was the first to approach, his weathered face split by a smile she hadn't seen from him before, wide and genuine and full of something that looked like triumph. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the rumble of engines and the crunch of boots on snow-packed ground. "We got to talking," Ray said, "on the truckers' forums online. About you, about Marcus, about what happened during the storm, and about what this place meant to people over the years." He gestured to the growing crowd of truckers climbing down from their cabs, bundled against the cold, their faces a mosaic of ages and backgrounds. "Turns out damn near every driver out there has a Marcus Carter story, or knows someone who does." Word spread fast. Sarah's hands had flown to her mouth. Maya appeared beside her, drawn by the noise, and stood staring at the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Marcus helped me change a tire outside Omaha back in '95, one trucker called out, a younger black man with kind eyes. I was a rookie scared out of my mind, didn't know a lug nut from a lug wrench. He spent 2 hours teaching me how to do it right. Wouldn't let me go until I could do it myself. He lent me money when my kid got sick and I couldn't afford the hospital bills," another said, an older white woman with a face like worn leather. "Said to pay it forward when I could. I've been trying to live up to that ever since. He stood up for me when some good old boys at a truck stop decided they didn't like my kind eating at their counter," a Hispanic man added quietly. "This was back in '04 down in Texas. Your husband made it real clear that I was eating wherever I damned well pleased. Then he sat down and had breakfast with me to prove the point." On and on they came, these stories. Each one a piece of Marcus she'd never known. Each one a testament to a life spent giving without counting the cost. Ray raised his voice to be heard over the murmuring crowd. Marcus's legacy deserves better than a foreclosure sign. So we made some calls. From the back of the crowd, a man in his 50s emerged, wearing a company polo shirt rather than the typical trucker's flannel and denim. He had the bearing of someone used to being in charge, but his eyes were respectful as he approached Sarah. "Mrs. Carter, my name is William Porter. I'm Regional Operations Manager for Porter Continental Trucking. We run about 80 rigs through this part of Colorado regularly." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My drivers need a place where they're treated like human beings instead of just customers. Where they can get a decent meal and feel safe for a few hours. After hearing what you did during that storm, and after learning about your husband's history, I'd like to make Carter's Kitchen an official stop for our company. We'd establish a regular schedule, guarantee a certain number of customers per day. It wouldn't be charity. It would be good business for both of us." Before Sarah could process what he was saying, another company representative stepped forward, a black woman in her 40s with an authoritative air and warm eyes. "Tamika Washington, Operations Director for Midwest Express," she said, extending her hand. "We've got 45 drivers on rates through here. After what I heard about you and about your husband, I'd be honored to make this an official stop for our fleet as well." Then another company stepped forward, and another. Representatives from trucking outfits Sarah had never heard of, all pledging their business, all committing to make Carter's Kitchen a regular stop for their drivers. Ray handed Sarah an envelope, thick, heavy, sealed. His hands were gentle as he pressed it into hers. "Donations," he explained, his voice rough with emotion, "from trucking companies, independent drivers, people who remember Marcus or who heard what you did during the storm. People who believe that places like this matter, that people like you matter." He paused, making sure she was looking at him. Between company donations, independent drivers, and a few old-timers who owed Marcus more than they could ever repay, it added up faster than we expected. Should be enough to catch up your mortgage and restock your supplies. With some left over to get that furnace fixed properly. Sarah's knees went weak. Maya caught her, held her up, both of them shaking now. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered. "Say you'll keep this place going," Ray replied. "For Marcus, for all of us who need to know that somewhere out there, there's still a light on, that someone still cares." An older trucker pushed through the crowd, white hair, face like worn leather, eyes that had seen decades of highway. He was carrying something carefully in his weathered hands, cradling it like something precious and fragile. "Found this in my storage unit last night when Ray put the word out," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He held it out to Sarah. "Your husband gave it to me when my own CB broke down. Must have been 20-some years ago. Said he had a spare, told me to keep it." The man's voice cracked. "I always meant to return it, but I never got the chance. Figured it should come back home now." Sarah took the CB radio handset, her hands trembling so hard she almost dropped it. The plastic was worn smooth from years of use, the cord slightly frayed but still intact. It would fit perfectly with the base unit she'd been packing away just minutes ago, the one she'd almost wrapped up and buried in a box. A perfect fit. Just like these people who had suddenly filled the empty space in her life. "There's one more thing," Ray said, leading Sarah back toward the diner entrance. He nodded to someone in the crowd. A young man stepped forward, maybe 25, with artistic hands and nervous energy. He was carrying a large rolled paper. "Mrs. Carter, I'm Kevin Miller. I do graphic design when I'm not helping my dad with his rig." He glanced at the older trucker who'd brought the CB radio. "That's my dad, Terrence. Anyway, we thought maybe." He unrolled the paper to reveal a design for a new sign, rendered in warm colors that seemed to glow even on the page. The sign read, "Carter's Trucker Haven, where the highway meets home." Beneath that, in smaller letters, "Built on kindness, sustained by community." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The design was beautiful, professional but warm, modern but respectful of the diner's history. It honored everything Marcus had built without being a shrine to the past. "The old highway might have moved," Ray said quietly, "but we're the highway. We go where we need to go, and we can make sure every trucker in 6 states knows about this place. Social media, CB channels, trucking forums, word of mouth, will spread it far and wide. Carter's Trucker Haven will become legendary on this route." Someone had already gone inside and connected the CB handset to the base unit. The radio crackled to life for the first time in 5 years, making Sarah jump. Static filled the air for a moment, then voices filtered through, clear and strong. "Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk eastbound on 29. Just heard about Carter's Trucker Haven. Anyone been there? Roger that, Nighthawk. This is Silver Fox. Stopped there during that big storm couple days ago. Best coffee and hospitality you'll find anywhere. Mrs. Carter's the real deal, just like her husband was. 10-4, Silver Fox. Adding it to my regular stops. Tell Mrs. Carter the whole convoy sends their respect. Sarah listened to voices passing between strangers, talking about her, about Marcus, about this place like it mattered. Like it was important, like it was worth saving. Maya appeared at her side, tears streaming down her face. Mama, should I start some coffee? Sarah looked at the sea of faces before her, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, young, old, all different but all the same in the way that mattered. She looked at the line of trucks stretching into the distance, their lights creating rivers of illumination in the gathering dusk. She looked at the diner that had been empty for so long, now surrounded by more people than she'd seen in 3 years. She thought of Marcus, of his unending kindness that had rippled outward for decades without her even knowing, of how he'd given and given without ever expecting anything in return. Of how he'd taught her, through 30 years of marriage and 5 years of memory, that generosity wasn't something you did when you could afford it, it was who you were, regardless of circumstance. And now finally, impossibly, that generosity was coming back. Start the coffee, Sarah said, her voice breaking with emotion. And call Darla from down the street, she used to waitress. See if Miguel Garcia is available too, he's been looking for kitchen work since the Riverside closed. Tell them both we're going to need help. She looked at the crowd, at the impossible blessing standing before her. Something tells me we're about to get real busy. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that felt less like real life and more like one of those dreams you have where everything impossible becomes possible. Darla arrived first, Sarah's neighbor, a woman in her 60s who'd been waitressing since before Sarah was born. She took one look at the crowd and tied on an apron without asking a single question. Miguel came next, a young man with steady hands and a quiet demeanor who'd been out of work since the Riverside restaurant closed 6 months ago. He walked into the kitchen, saw the empty freezer and bare pantry, and immediately started taking inventory. Don't worry about supplies, Mrs. Carter, he called over his shoulder. Let's see what we've got to work with first. The truckers themselves had brought food from their own rigs, canned goods, packages of pasta, frozen meat from their coolers, even fresh vegetables that someone had been hauling to Denver. They piled it all on the counter like offerings at an altar, like they understood without being told that Sarah had given them everything she had and now had nothing left. Can't have you feeding us with an empty pantry, one said. This is what your husband would have done for us, said another. Sarah and her impromptu staff worked through the evening. Miguel proved to be a master at stretching limited supplies into filling meals. Darla moved through the dining room like she'd been working there for years, calling out orders and refilling coffee cups before they were even empty. Maya coordinated everything with a natural leadership Sarah hadn't seen in her daughter before, directing traffic and making sure no one fell through the cracks. Around 9 o'clock, when the initial chaos had settled into something resembling a rhythm, Ray found Sarah in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her hands moving automatically while her mind tried to process everything that had happened. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, you should know something. Sarah turned, wiping her hands on her apron. That envelope we gave you, you should count it when you get a chance. He paused, his expression serious. It's more than just enough to catch up the mortgage. A lot more. There's enough there to expand if you want to build what this place deserves to be. Sarah's throat tightened. I can't accept that much. It's not charity, Ray interrupted firmly. It's investment. Every company that pledged their business tonight meant it. They'll be here regularly, and they'll pay good money for meals and services. This is the trucking community taking care of its own. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle despite his size. Your husband took care of us for decades, Mrs. Carter. Let us take care of his family now. That's what he would have wanted. After Ray left to join the others, Sarah finally opened the envelope with shaking hands. She had to sit down when she saw the amount, $47,000. She counted it 3 times, certain she'd made a mistake, but the bills kept adding up to the same impossible total, more money than she'd seen at once in her entire life. She thought of the foreclosure notice that gave her 30 days, of the 3 months of missed mortgage payments, of the broken furnace and the ancient refrigerator that barely worked and the roof that leaked every spring. Of Maya's deferred dreams and abandoned scholarship. She thought of Marcus, of his calloused hands and his generous heart, of the way he'd worked himself to exhaustion to buy this place and make it something special. We're going to make it, she whispered to the photograph she'd rewrapped and placed behind the counter. Marcus, we're really going to make it. Later that night, after most of the truckers had left and only a few remained drinking coffee and sharing quiet conversation, Sarah found herself at a booth with Ray, Maya, and Kevin Miller. The sign is beautiful, Sarah said, looking at Kevin's design again. But I have to ask, did you know Marcus? You look too young to have crossed paths with him. Kevin shook his head, then smiled. No ma'am, but my father did. That's him over there, Terrence Miller. He's the one who brought back the CB radio, and he's the one who organized about half of this convoy. The older gentleman, Maya asked. That's him. Kevin's expression grew thoughtful. My dad doesn't talk much about his past. He's a quiet man, keeps things inside. But when Ray put out the call about you and this place, something changed. Dad stayed up all night making phone calls, called in favors from people he hadn't spoken to in years, called people I didn't even know he knew. He paused, his voice dropping. He told me your husband saved his life once. Not just helped him out, actually saved his life. And he said he'd been waiting 20 years for a chance to pay that debt. Sarah felt her eyes well up again. I don't know that story. Maybe you should hear it from him, Ray suggested quietly. They found Terrence Miller standing outside, despite the cold, looking up at the stars. The storm had cleared completely, leaving the night sky impossibly bright with the kind of stars you only see far from cities. When Sarah approached, he turned, and she saw tears on his weathered face. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you 5 years ago at your husband's funeral, but I couldn't. I wasn't strong enough then. You don't have to, Sarah began. Yes I do, Terrence said firmly. I need you to understand why we're all here, why this matters so much. They sat on the bench outside the diner, the same bench where Marcus used to sit during his breaks, watching the highway traffic and waving at passing trucks. Terrence took his time gathering his thoughts, his breath visible in the cold air. It was winter of '98, he began. Late December, I was driving through Wyoming in the middle of a snowstorm. Shouldn't have been on the road at all, but I was running from something. He paused, his jaw working. My wife had just left me, took my son, Kevin, with her. Said I was never home, that I loved the road more than I loved them. And the worst part was, she was right. Sarah waited, sensing he needed to tell this his own way. I was distracted, not paying attention like I should have been. My rig started to jackknife on black ice. I overcorrected. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Nearly went off a cliff, would have too, except there was another driver behind me. He saw what was happening, used his own rig to block the highway, put on his hazards, then got out in the middle of that storm. Terrence looked at Sarah, his eyes intense with the weight of old gratitude and old pain. Your husband didn't just help me get my rig under control, Mrs. Carter. He talked to me, really talked to me, for 3 hours while we waited for a tow truck. He kept me on that CB radio. And somewhere in those 3 hours, I told him things I'd never told anyone. About my marriage falling apart, about my son who barely knew me, about how I was thinking maybe it would be easier if I just kept driving through that storm, just kept going until something happened. Sarah's hand went to her mouth. Marcus knew, Terrence continued, he knew what I was saying without me saying it directly, and he talked me down. Told me about his own struggles, his own doubts, told me about almost giving up on his dream of owning this place, told me about his daughter Maya, who was just a baby then, and how becoming a father had changed everything for him. Terrence wiped his eyes roughly. He made me promise 2 things that night. First, that I'd call my son as soon as I got to a phone. Second, that I'd keep living, keep trying, keep showing up. Did you? Maya asked softly, her own voice choked with tears. Call your son. Terrence smiled, gesturing to where Kevin stood talking with other truckers. Every week for the next 20 years, it took time, but we rebuilt our relationship from nothing. Rebuilt it into something real and strong. He's my whole world now. He turned back to Sarah. I owe your husband everything, Mrs. Carter. My life, my relationship with my son, my second chance at being the man I should have been all along. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, a different one, separate from the collective donation. When Marcus helped me that night, he also lent me $5,000 from his own savings. Said I'd need it to get back on my feet, to afford a lawyer for the custody dispute, to have something to fall back on while I figured things out. Terrence's voice was steady now, determined. I paid him back 2 years later, with interest, even though he said not to bother with the interest. And I made him a promise that if I ever had the means, I'd pass that kindness forward. I've been saving for years, waiting for the right moment." He placed the envelope on the bench between them. $20,000, enough to cover what you still need after the convoy's donation. Enough to expand, enough to build something that will last. He looked Sarah directly in the eyes. "And before you say you can't accept it, remember this: refusing it means refusing to honor what your husband taught me."